Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University. We're just absolutely delighted to launch the IMES-MERIP Middle East Report Information Project Public Outreach Partnership today with a focus on environmental activism in North Africa. And in case you don't know, IMES is an institute at GW housed within the Elliott School that focuses on providing an important intellectual community for all things related to the modern Middle East. So we support faculty, graduate students. We house the Middle East Studies program, and we do an abundance of programs for visiting scholars, doctoral students focused on the Middle East, and conferences, workshops, lectures, aimed at educators as well as the policy community and broader community. And we're really delighted to launch IMPOP as part of our focus on producing multimedia outputs for educators, activists, and a broader public. So we are joined today by some really wonderful guests. So the moderation will be held by Katie Natanel, who's a senior lecturer in gender studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. And her research explores how gender and sexuality shaped and are shaped by political participation and mobilization, conflict, and political violence. And she is going also representing her position as the managing director. Is that right, Katie? I think I messed that up. Of MERIP.
Executive editor.
Executive editor. Sorry, I knew I was going to mess that up. Executive editor, sorry, new position of the Middle East Report of MERIP, which has a partnership with GW and with the University of Exeter. We are also joined by Mimi Kirk, who is IMES's outreach coordinator, and she has been really the mastermind behind all of this, coordinating between authors, artists, cartographers, political cartoonists, us, and MERIP. So she'll be introducing the project, and then we're delighted to be joined by two other scholars, Nejm Benaissah, who is assistant professor at Georgetown University in the anthropology department, and his research interests include climate change, the everyday politics of water, infrastructure, environmental justice, and social movements across the Sahara, Algeria, and the broader region. And he's currently working on a project looking at the potential for upscaling ways to commonly govern important goods for humankind, like water, the atmosphere, art, and digital knowledge. He's also worked on voluntary associations and and water management in North Africa, looking at micro movements and how they may be managing or changing customary governmental regimes in the region. We are joined also by Karen Rignall, who is Community and Leadership Development Professor at the University of Kentucky. And her research interests include rural livelihoods and economic development, anthropology of rural land life, land tenure, land rights, and labor migration. We had her here at IMES last year, presenting on her book, An Elusive Common, Land, Politics, and Agrarian Rurality in a Moroccan Oasis. She is also the author of one of the MERIP pieces, co-author of one of the MERIP pieces that are featured today, and that we'll be walking through some of the multimedia work. And then we're just absolutely delighted to be joined by Hamdi Hashed, who is an activist and environmental engineer in Tunisia. He's also featured on the Tunisia page as part of the IMPOP gallery, which we'll be sharing with you in a few minutes. And we are also joined by Kelly Pemberton, who is Associate Professor of Religion and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies, and she has provided some of our photographs for Morocco. And I'm not sure if, is Noelle here? I don't see her. Okay, so I'll skip that. But last but not least, we also have our cartographer, Grace Doherty, who is a GIS consultant at the World Bank, and she was a student at GW, did her master's several years ago in the geography department, and worked extensively with me on poverty in Morocco. So I think I've covered everyone. I would like to thank all of the people who have been part of this project. This is a pilot that we've been working on for the past year. And I'd like to thank Christian Clinton from the Institute for Middle East Studies, our newly appointed research manager, and Shana Marshall, our associate director, who have all been part of this journey, producing infographics and coordinating and so on. I think that's everybody. I hope I didn't forget anyone. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to pass the microphone over to Katie, who will introduce MERIP, and then she'll pass it on to Mimi, who will introduce the IMPOP products. And then we're going to have a really nice, vibrant conversation between Katie, Nejm, and Karen, as well as some of our other guests who are here today. So thank you so much for joining us. And Katie, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thank you, Mona. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone and to take part in this launch event of a really, really exciting platform. So like you said, I'm just going to give a little bit of background on MERIP and talk about the collaboration and partnership that we've entered into with IMES and GW, and also everyone who's worked on the IMPOP platform, which is, again, just something that's really exciting. So MERIP, for those of you who may not know, is the Middle East Research and Information Project, which was established in 1971 to educate and inform the public about contemporary Middle East affairs. So just in autumn 2021, MERIP celebrated 50 years. And MERIP is in its material and digital form. It's a quarterly magazine. It's not an academic journal, and everyone is quite clear on that, which is organized around themes. So, for example, the issues we've had in 2022, so this year's issues, the spring issue was Settler Colonialism's Enduring Entanglements. And then summer's issue, which was really driven, I think, quite beautifully and deftly, if I may say so, by Shana, was Currencies of Power. Next up, our autumn issue is going to be an issue on sports, which coincides with the lead up and the opening of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. So MERIP is really special in what it is and what it does. And I think I'm learning this very, very deeply, very closely as I step into the role of executive editor. MERIP is a collective project, which is supported by an amazing group of scholars, educators, activists, and commentators working in and on, and many being of the Middle East and North Africa or SWANA region. What's special about MERIP, I think, analytically, is the focus on state power, political economy, and social hierarchies, but also I think the focus on and really the commitment to popular struggles, so struggles for self-determination, liberation, revolution, as well as I think a critical analytical commitment to engaging with the role of foreign policy in the region. And historically, it's been really a close focus on US foreign policy. But MERIP isn't simply about academic research. I think maybe I can speak for all of us and just say that it's a personal and political and intellectual investment in the region and its communities. And as I said, many of us, many people who are working with MERIP call it home, while others are deeply connected in other ways. So MERIP is also a commitment to working beyond the boundaries of academia. Like I said, I felt very clear that MERIP is a magazine. It is not an academic journal, and I appreciate that. It's about questioning and expanding the limits or the boundaries of what knowledge is and where it's situated, asking who knowledge is for, who is at the center of our work, and what it might do or what it might contribute to. And Shana and I have spoken really actually frequently about how MERIP pieces are often really central or pivotal to teaching in university settings, not least some of the primers that we have on Iraq, and Palestine, Israel, and water. And these appear on lots of syllabi. But the IMPOP platform, like in this launch event, is really kind of an exciting effort to translate academic research and analysis into like truly public scholarship. It's an opportunity for us to work with new partners and in new media in ways that can directly benefit educators, organizers, and activists. So as you'll see, Mimi's going to walk us through it in just a minute. The platform is dynamic and engaging, it's critical and accessible, and I think it's really beautiful, and that's thanks to the cartographers, the cartoonists, the people who've worked so diligently is the word that's coming up, but I think powerfully in sound and imagery. And we invite everybody who's here today to spend some time moving among the pages and looking at the content, reflecting on how it can support the work that you're doing at present, but also the work that you might be doing in the future. I think as well for me, where I sit kind of politically, pedagogically, intellectually, I think it's important to say that we consider this to be really a dialogical project. So IMPOP, this platform is going to be something that responds to its users and it grows through engagement, much like MERIP has itself over the last 50 years. So just to wrap up, while I'm relatively new to MERIP, I think I can say that this collaborative and creative initiative, this partnership, is something that we're really proud of. And I'm personally looking forward to exploring the platform and its content with everyone today. So with that, my 5 minutes are up and I will hand over to Mimi. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks everyone for being with us today. Just to say first, it was a real pleasure to work with Dr. Ataya and Dr. Marshall and Kristen Clinton this year on this project, as well as all the other contributors, some of whom of course are with us today. So just a few words before I share my screen. So as we were talking about, of course, last fall, we selected MERIP content for this pilot. And this project's goal, as you've heard, is to inform the broader public, including educators and activists, about the contemporary Middle East through multimedia elements. We decided to highlight content on environmental activism in North Africa, given MERIP's strong content on the subject, as well as the topic's current importance and connections with environmental justice work here in North America, in the broader Middle East region, and beyond. So I'm going to today walk you through a few elements of the articles we selected. There are 4 in total that are highlighted on Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. And today I'm going to be looking at Morocco and Algeria with you. So let me just share my screen. Okay. All right, so first let's go to Morocco. So the first article in MERIP is called Global Aspirations and Local Realities of Solar Energy in Morocco. It was published in the fall of 2020, and the authors are Atman Aoui, Moulay Ahmed Al-Amrani, and Karen Rignall, who's with us today. And it looks at how the Moroccan government has capitalized on its sunny, arid regions to produce solar power, focusing particularly on the Noor solar installation in Ouarzazate in southern Morocco, and looks at local residents' expressions of discontent in recent years due to repression and economic marginalization by the state. And the article in particular traces, and I'm going to give a quote from it, it traces how, quote, structures of authoritarianism can facilitate the rapid expansion of renewable energy while also reinforcing existing social and economic inequalities, challenging assumptions that a low carbon energy transition is inherently progressive. So it's a very important article in that it problematizes that a simplistic narrative about renewable energy. So let's start to look at some of the elements. We have a blurb here at the top, and then we did an interview with Dr. Soraya Al-Khlawi of Ghent University. And in the interview, she gives some context. She speaks about the Moroccan state's land grabs for a variety of projects, including solar energy, and how these grabs are possible due to the continuation of colonial law. So I'm just going to play, maybe just a minute from this 7 or 8 minute interview. Here she's talking about the land grab in terms of the Noor Solar Complex. So let me find the spot here, and hopefully you can be able to hear all this. Let's see.
Solar installation also created a lot of problem in terms of water and in terms of land, because also it was installed in like collective land, so they expropriate all the village from the land. But in that case, it was so crazy, the omerta about that, you know. It was really, it's really difficult to talk to people, to get interview with the people in the village. People are really afraid to speak about that. So there was no mobilization there, and it was even difficult to get any information, to be honest. So we know that there is a problem there about water, and that this and solar project created a lot of inequality, but it's difficult to hear about, you know. Like, except the work of Karen Rignall, there's not a lot about it.
Okay, and I'm assuming you could all hear that okay. So let's see here. Okay, and a nice shout out to Karen as well. Okay, so moving on. So in that interview, Dr. El-Khahlaoui spoke about water use and inequality. So in this infographic slideshow here, the infographic talks about the project and how it uses water resources that are already dwindling. It gives data on the local reservoir that supplies water to Noor and Ouarzazate, and how much water Noor uses and for what purposes, and how per person water availability in Morocco is decreasing to a current level of scarcity, with a projection for absolute scarcity by 2030. So I will just scroll through this. You can see solar energy and water use in Morocco. This is some visuals of the reservoir and the complex in Ouarzazate. Water uses of the Noor complex, and the annual per person water availability in Morocco, showing how it is falling. And next we'll go on to the map. The map shows where solar plants are located in Morocco, as we talked about, in arid rural communities where water scarcity threatens farming. And here you can see right here the Noor complex near Ouarzazate. Thanks to Grace, our cartographer, for that. And then the political cartoon we commissioned from Dina Mohammed, the political cartoonist and designer and artist. And of course, this demonstrates the tension between local farmers and large energy infrastructure installations like Noor. You see the solar panel sort of coming down on the farmers there. And last, here we have an image slideshow. Author Karen Rignall kindly supplied a number of photos that illustrate the landscape, other projects in Morocco, such as mining, and those projects' repercussions for farming, and how collective land is divided and used for such projects. So I'll scroll through these. And of course, we invite you to take more time and look at these on your own. Here's a photo of some of the collective land being divided. Okay, and then below this, of course, you can find the rest of the article, or I'm sorry, the beginning of the article. Then you click here and that will take you to the MERIP site, and you can have the entire text. And then we have some recommended reading and resources. So let me just take you through one more of the articles, this one on Algeria. Okay, so this article from MERIP was titled, "Algeria is Not for Sale, Mobilizing Against Fracking in the Sahara" by Nejm Benaissah, and it was also published in the fall of 2020. It traces protests against fracking in several southern Algerian cities in 2014 and 2015. And these protests demonstrated the intersection of political and environmental questions, and also paved the way for peaceful modes of resistance, such as those that were seen in the nationwide uprising called the Hirak movement that began in 2019. So let's look at the interview here. And this was conducted by the author, Nejm Benaissah, and she interviewed former national coordinator for Algeria's unemployed movement, Ibek Abdelmalek, who was very involved in protests against fracking. and against the marginalization of Southern Algeria. So here they're going to speak, and I'll again play just about a minute about that marginalization and the relationship between the northern and southern parts of the country. Let me find this here.
أنا نذكر باللي في نفس الوقت كنتوا تهضروا على يعني التهميش، قلت له يعني باللي يعني مواطنين الجنوب في خطر، يعني خاصة هم في خطر، ويعني إنه هذا قضية الغاز الصخري قضية يعني بتزيد على كل المشاكل اللي شاف الجنوب، زي يعني البطالة، التهميش، عدم التنمية etc. يعني ممكن تقول كم كلمات على هذا الموضوع الثاني؟
ايه احنا هذاك الوقت كنا نقولوا باللي هي الحكومه كانت تتهم فينا احنا باللي رانا نديروا في حركات انفصاليه باش نقسموا الشمال على الجنوب، وباش نديروا الجنوب، وباش نديروا حركه انفصاليه، ولكن الواقع يقول شيء واحد اخر. الواقع يقول انه السلطه كانت مهمله الجنوب، ومازال لحد الان راهي مهمله الجنوب، ولكن احنا كنا نحوسوا كيفاش نديروا نربطوا الجنوب مع الشمال، كيفاش نكونوا مواطنين على مع درجه واحده مع المواطنين تاع الشمال. كيفاش
Okay. All right, so moving down here to the political cartoon. This is from a different cartoonist we commissioned from Khaled El-Bayet. And it shows here how international actors, in this case the French, given the colonial history, of course, work with the Algerian government to suck the resources from the country. You can see with the straw here, and they're sucking the oil, and how the Hirak movement moves in to try to block that. And then we'll look at the infographic slideshow next. This infographic also looks at water, because there are huge amounts of water that are used for fracking. So for instance, the infographic explains that 96% of water used in Algeria comes from the mostly non-renewable Northwest Sahara aquifer, and that annual extraction of this water already exceeds renewal by 1.5 billion cubic meters. So we'll just look at this briefly. There's the Northwest Sahara aquifer, some statistics on the water, and then this is how much each well for fracking uses. It's equivalent to 4 to 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And here's the map. Now the map shows, it features anti-fracking protests in the country in 2014 and 2015, and shows, for instance, how mobilizations occurred in both the north and the south, bringing those populations together, and how also the areas targeted for shale gas overlap with groundwater reserves. So you can see that in the shading there. And again, invite you to look at this more closely. And then finally, the image slideshow, we had some images that Karen Rignall, Noel Belachtar, the author, supplied, and it shows a protest in 2015 in the city of Ouargla. That's in, of course, southern Algeria, that was organized by the unemployed movement and the anti-fracking coalition. And then finally, we have the beginning of the article where you can go to the full piece on MERIP's site, and recommended reading and resources below. Okay, so let me stop my share. I'll stop there and hand it back to Katie. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Mimi. And as we said before, you're welcome to be looking at the website and working through the different pages and interactive resources as our conversation unfolds today. But first, I would like to invite one of our wonderful guests, Nejm, to speak to us. And we'll have Nejm and Karen speak about their work on the project separately for just a few minutes apiece, and then we'll come together in conversation. And after the conversation, which is myself and Nejm and Karen, we'll open this to questions from our wonderful audience. So that will start at noon-ish, your time, 5 p.m. my time in the UK. So Nejm, thank you and welcome. And yes, it's wonderful to have you here. I want to ask you, just as a way of opening our engagement with you today, about your work, really. So as an environmental anthropologist, your work is really on the cutting edge of scholarship and activism. with the huge potential to positively and materially intervene in the climate crisis. And I can't underline how significant that really is. Your research spans from the Sahara to the Middle East, but we're going to invite you specifically today to set the scene for us in terms of North Africa. So my question to you is, how has scholarship on North Africa evolved over the last few years? And what are some of those emerging themes? Over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Katie. Thank you, and congratulations on your new post as executive editor, as we now have it right. And thank you first off to Mona for inviting me to participate in this, and wonderful to see you again, Karen. And so this kind of overview of the themes of the kind of cutting edge scholarship on climate change and activism in North Africa, I would say it's a burgeoning kind of issue, but I would say largely the biggest themes within that scholarship around energy, which Karen's work especially speaks to, and water, which is what I've been working on all this time. And so to kind of break down those major themes of energy and water, these tend to include bigger topics like political ecology or environmental justice approaches to the environment and activism. There's a lot of work on critical infrastructure, and also social movements. And I'll attempt to kind of break these down a little bit more. So this will be somewhat more of a subjective and personal overview of those kind of themes, rather than a completely comprehensive review. Also, I'll expand beyond just environmental anthropology, as I like to pick up on different kinds of critical scholarship, which I think speak to these issues. So the first theme that I would really describe as being at the cutting edge is this kind of theme of decolonial energy futures within anthropology and beyond. And so there have been themes such as solarity, Karen's fantastic work around solar kind of mega projects and extraction as really environmental justice issues. I think, as we'll get to speak about with Karen, is that these are often framed as being, very liberal, being, having this justice approach. And of course, often the South, as we're talking in North Africa, the Sahara just experiences these as extractive kind of projects rather than things that give back. Using the Sahara as a cash cow for the elites is a theme that's come up over and again in my work in Algeria as well. I'm going to spread out. We know Goxa Gunnell's work is actually in the UAE, it's not North Africa, but very important in relation to energy, Abu Dhabi, and so on. So that's decolonial energy futures. I can come back to that because I see that as one of the most interesting themes. But then we have water infrastructures, and this is related to environmental justice and questions of hydraulic citizenship. And so Jessica Barnes' work in Egypt has been incredibly important, and I followed her as well as Karen's work very closely, as it relates, very closely to my work in Algeria. We also have Tessa Farmer in Egypt, and this is essentially this kind of critical infrastructure studies is really looking at marginalized people as they're treated as second-class citizens. But what's interesting is not just how local people are victims, but how they actually manage to gain agency to access water infrastructures by bypassing patronage networks and so on. So that to me is a very, very interesting topic. So for me, those are the big things, but you have these more general topics, things like social movements, which I'm very interested in. And so you have different forms of change related to social movements. And of course, this has all been around the backdrop of, the Arab uprisings, the Jasmine Revolution. A lot of us are thinking about these different forms from revolutionary change to perhaps more gradual change. In Algeria, they very much wanted, they've gone for this non-violent approach with all of their history of bloodshed and so on and so on. I'm sure I can talk about social movements. Now, I just have another 2 or 3 themes. Adaptation and vulnerability are obviously key themes in the climate literature. And some of us, and Jeannie Sowers, of course, is a fantastic advocate of that work. And, we often see these terms used within the IPCC reports and so on, but a lot of us look at adaptation and vulnerability under a more critical lens. So my work particularly has kind of critiqued this idea of adaptation, adaptive management. A couple more themes. So we often see climate as an exacerbating factor rather than a direct thing. So we often kind of seem to refer to the symptoms, right? And so in relation to what are the most interesting themes for people on the ground, is my own work focused on water, land, and people, right? Climate didn't come up that often because I was looking at what they were interested in. People were aware of climate, but they were more focused on local issues. So this idea of climate as exacerbating social and environmental issues depends on which viewpoint you're looking at, whether you're the scholar or whether you're the person on the ground. Now, there's two more, or one more actually, that I'd like to see more, this kind of scholarship on digital dissidence and environmental movements. And of course, there was a lot of scholarship on Twitter and, you know, Facebook, etc., looking around the Arab Spring. Now, I would like to see more linking these together. I haven't seen this done too much in this region. And of course, digital activism has been more related to questions of dignity and human rights, but I would like to see more linked to climate leaders, and especially youth leaders who are surely at the forefront of this, although of course they carry an unfair burden, right? As we often refer to the next generation as having to carry all this. I'm sure we can break down some of those issues. So those are my main themes. I don't want to go over time. I have a lot to say, but we can break some of that down if you like, going forward.
Absolutely, and you've traced some really wonderful connections across your work and Karen's already, which sets us up nicely for the conversation. But yes, there's such a sense of richness and complexity that's coming out of the region, and as you say, bodies of scholarship and action that are not specifically environmental anthropology, but like touch it and move it in new directions. So yeah, we'll explore that together in just a bit as well. Karen, I'd like to invite you now to introduce your work and yourself a bit. And as with Nejm, I'll prompt you with a question. Your co-authored piece, which Mimi has shown us already, which is titled Global Aspirations and Local Realities of Solar Energy in Morocco, is completely brilliant. It's sharply critical and honestly quite worrying. While at the same time, it's pointing us toward things that can be done. We'll discuss this, of course, further in just a bit with Nejm as well. But for now, I was wanting to know if you could tell us a bit about how you actually arrived to writing this particular piece and developing the resource for this platform. Just in terms of like, how does it fit within your scholarly work and perhaps your activism more broadly? So I'll hand to you now, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for putting together both this launch event, but especially these materials, which I think will just be such a wonderful resource, even or perhaps especially for those of us who don't necessarily teach specifically Middle East classes, to be able to integrate this into other courses and other teaching is amazing. I will probably never teach a Middle East course at the University of Kentucky, so I have to surreptitiously kind of bring it in whenever I can. I am very pleased to have gone after Nejm because you provided this really wonderful overview of I think what's really exciting about work in this area right now is that it really crosses kind of scholarly and activist sort of, you know, domains in a way that I've seen in other areas, but until recently, at least in my experience, haven't necessarily seen in work in the Maghreb. So there's been this long tradition of incredible kind of activism, even in environmental justice issues, if we expand our view of what environmental justice looks like and the terms that are used for it. So it seems very thin to look at the sort of institutions and social movements using a kind of climate change or environmental justice label. But then if you actually look at the ways in which people mobilize what they're mobilizing around, then you see, in fact, that environmental activism and environmental injustice have very, very deep roots in social mobilizations. And thinking about social mobilizations also in non-traditional terms, that it doesn't only have to be the kind of manifestation and the harakat that we may normally sort of label as activism or as protest. So, I mean, I did not come to this work with an initial interest in energy, and I'm still learning all sorts of things about energy and extraction, because those are actually really intimately linked. I don't feel like you can look at energy transition, well, anywhere, but definitely not in the sort of southeastern periphery of Morocco without also looking at conventional mining and other forms of extraction. And so those are not separate topics. I learned that by virtue of my work here in Kentucky, where you can't think about activism or scholarship on legacy, on renewable energy without looking at legacy energy regimes. But my interest is in land and in the way people use and think and mobilize and signify land. So it is the marriage partner to Nejm's interest. I called you Nejma because that's my daughter's name. Nejm's interest in water. I use that term deliberately because in various parts of the Southeast, water and land rights are married, and in various places they are not. But in terms of the politics and the legal and juridical framework, they most definitely are. So it was in seeing new pressures on the land and literally in hearing people talk about the solar installation, 12 years ago now, that I started sort of coming into this work and thinking about environmental issues, energy transition, renewable energy and extraction, all as part of a larger ferment around political activities. So in certain respects, I'm less interested in the energy piece than in how it's mobilized. Of course, I am interested in the energy piece too, because people use these various sort of points of departure to ask questions and to make claims and demands around many, many different things. And so to understand rural politics, we need to think at different scales, different kind of discursive frameworks, and different timelines and chronologies. So certain social mobilizations can look like utter failures on the surface. The people who were occupying El Ben, which is the sort of protest site for the IMERIP silver mine, ended up disbanding. It looks like they didn't win that much, and yet politics were fundamentally transformed in the region, in part because of that social mobilization. Dana Powell, who does really, really interesting work on the Diné Navajo Nation around energy and extraction, talks about how a project doesn't even need to be built to produce politics. And that's what all of these projects are doing in the Middle East. And in Morocco, I will not make grand regional claims. And so I am kind of focused a little bit more on linking this work with kind of grassroots and civil society kinds of activism. So the scholarly piece of it needs to catch up. Like I need to find time to write some of this stuff up. And so occasional little pieces sort of make it out. And so I would like to say that it's because I've become this sort of incredible grassroots activist. It's not that, it's that we are all like, drowning, right? And that I'm involved in this kind of network of activity and just thinking about the iterative nature of research. And I'll just finish with one small example, and then we can have the dialogue piece. So my current project is focused on comparing residents' experience of a copper mine in the province of Zagora, and then this large solar installation that's in the process of, it's sort of on hold in Midelt, to really surface some of these comparisons between extraction and renewable energy. But I've spent some time in the archives in Rabat, which are evocative. So I'll have to go to France for sure. people in Blida and Zagora, which is right next to the Boazar cobalt mine, the scene of a lot of protests actually, for many years, don't know the full history of these mines, of how they were developed during the early colonial period, and of the kinds of agreements and political dealings that ended up enclosing and really expropriating the land. So just spending a few days in the archives, I'm able to find these letters from the Pasha of Marrakesh, from Glaoui, the sort of Grand Qaid who took all of these lands. These are histories that people don't know, and they've never seen the documents. And so part of what we're going to be doing is writing this up for the local media in Zagora. And I will obviously have to get permission to share the actual documents, but for people to be able to see the ways in which, even before this region was conquered by the French, so in the late 20s and early 30s, in fact, the sort of dealing and expropriation and land grabbing was already happening. That to me is really important because it helps to explain contemporary claims that people feel like they can and can't make. And it also kind of connects people to a history of their resources, of their patrimony, of their politics. And so, that's the kind of iterative nature I feel like this research can go in. So I'll stop there. Like Nejma, I could keep on going.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Excellent. This is a great transition, a great point for us to launch into the conversation. And then just to remind everyone, we will have time for a Q&A after with our audience. So if questions are arising, you can put them in the chat, or actually what I'll do is invite people to raise their hands and then unmute and turn on their video to address our guests here today. So either way, but if things come up and you want to put them in the chat, please go ahead and do that in advance of the open question and answer. So my questions are going to be to you both, and then there'll be another one in which we invite some of the other contributors to reflect as well. My first question is, I guess they're all quite reflective and thinking across the work that you do here and also your work beyond, but then also the work that I do. But one of the things that I'm most struck by is how you both hold the climate crisis together with social movements, and we've heard that in both of the very short introductions that you've given us just now. We never see the climate crisis or social movements in isolation, which suggests that we can't talk about power without talking about resistance, and we're talking about agency as well. So people are taking action in the ways that they can, confronting, maneuvering, and imagining, despite enormous obstacles and against major actors, including states, regimes, and corporations, which is obviously no small feat. So my question is, what compels you to work in this way, to hold these things, these actors, these forces together, and what can we learn from this approach? I'll hand it to you.
I guess I'll start, I think very, very briefly and simply, and I really like the way that you phrased that, Katie, because I think it holds the essence of the answer. You can't find, power without resistance. And I think for me, and I'll put this on a personal note, because I do like to hear where people are coming from in their motivations behind working. And I was reflecting on this question with my students very recently. And so I was talking to some of them about their, future potential work, future research. And I myself was trained as an environmentalist. I started off, very much looking at biology, looking at the environment from that perspective. But I very, very quickly started to hone in on looking at people. I was lucky enough to have kind of cultural anthropology, sociology, and those kind of issues. And so to be quite honest, from a human perspective, it was incredibly depressing to start thinking about the planet falling to pieces, right? We had all of these extinction events, we had pollution, we have the oceans, we have climate change. And this may sound strange, but looking back on it all, in this conversation to my students, I said to them, oh, it looks like I've moved into social movements because that's where I find hope. So that to me is, as a researcher who needs to do something, that's where I'm coming from on this work. And to put it the other side of the equation, as researchers, I think we should, to use a quote from The Wire, is to follow the money, right? You follow the research where it needs to go, and to see what people are interested in on the ground, rather than imposing our own frameworks, our own ideas, our own preferred kind of theoretical perspective, and really see what is most engaging people on the ground and to do a service to them, right? And so that's what I've really tried to do with my work. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Karen, this reflection by Nejm, it makes me think of, like, you just said to us, sometimes with social movements or uprisings and the different forms that agency and mobilization can take, success isn't obvious. Things can look like they've failed and still be achieving or working toward a new future or a set of goals. So yeah, I find there's a touch point there. But I invite you to to respond to the prompt as well.
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Nejm said. That's definitely my kind of trajectory and understanding. And I would just add kind of one thing that I've seen even in my more agrarian oriented work is I think anthropology helps us not impose political subjectivities on people. I mean, it's not disciplinary. Anyone can have a sort of generous listening approach, but I do really focus on the fact that there are a lot of kind of discursive frameworks for environmental justice and social movements that have very idealized languages for what it means to resist, what it means to rise up, and often some frustration when people who live around a really destructive plant or mine are saying, well, we're actually okay with it. We would just like jobs. We would like to have some investment in the area. There, when there isn't a radical critique of kind of environmental degradation or capitalism or authoritarianism, but in fact, folks are making very kind of bread and butter issues at their forefront. I think really important different forms of social mobilization together, and to do that historical work of understanding why particular claims take the form that they do. So, and instead of sort of only putting forward the folks who are talking in more, say, radical or anti-capitalist or sort of globalized terms, trying to understand the way these particular issues fit into larger political puzzles. And what are people talking about when they're talking about jobs or development? Sure, they're talking about jobs and development, but they're also not talking about claims that have been foreclosed, modes of discourse that have been repressed, and often don't have a framework for understanding that, hey, we could make bigger claims. And so I do feel like there's a piece or space in both the scholarship and the activism for many kind of points of entry, including occupying a mountaintop. That's important too. But there are also other ways in which people are mobilizing, and often in ways that don't quite capture the imagination of European and American activists who really want to go to the site of occupation and don't necessarily want to go to kind of fiscal meetings at the commune, where some of this work really does have to happen at the level of like tax structure and the way royalties are paid and how land is adjudicated. So that to me is a very important piece of this work, and is a place where a scholar who may not really have a place legitimately in, at the mountaintop kind of occupying land, can, however, dig into the history of the legal framework, can dig into the archives, can make this available, can democratize information. That's kind of one of the pillars of the project that we're working on is, people need to know what permitting laws are and, what the tax structure is. And that helps them imagine bigger and different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's both of your answers really, or your responses, I guess, reflect how you're working across like scales, discussions, debates, communities, contexts. And that's where I want to take us next, is thinking about working across contexts in the ways that you do. It's incredibly inspiring. I see it as a kind of a connective thinking and doing, and that feels especially important when it comes to the climate crisis, making these connections, these linkages, working in the ways that you do. Nejm, I know you've recently started work on fracking and protests in Algeria, which we have a piece on with the platform as well. And you're also exploring governance by local institutions around water in the Sahara. So we're moving across and between contexts here. And as you said, your real specialty is the water rights, water politics, and that project. And Karen, you have your work on energy in Morocco, which is at the forefront of my mind and of our launch today. But also your research similarly spans like a much broader geographical region, and you've invoked Kentucky quite a lot, where you are at the moment, and where you teach, and where you're, I guess, institutionally based. At the same time, you've worked in Egypt and West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and Southeast Asia, and not always as a researcher. So you're both working in these, as I say, like these really connective ways. So I want to ask, how do you do this? How do you connect contexts and communities and struggles? So I feel like as scholars, educators, organizers, and activists, we have something to learn in terms of working in similar ways, where you embed like what is a very specific local context within like regional and global fields. So how are you working in these ways? And I think at the same time, really importantly, making sure your work remains both accessible and accountable. I'll hand to you.
I'm making you go first, Nejm, so that I can only like follow on what you say. So maybe I should, carry some water myself. I wish I had an answer to your question. I'm still figuring this out, and I don't know if that can be disentangled from, the pandemic or just, where I am career-wise. But, it's not necessarily easy. But I just think long-term engagement has been what's helped me out a lot is, understanding everyone's positionality. Here I'm talking specifically with the people I'm working in Southeast Morocco, and in understanding that I can't do research in the same way that I used to. I'm not likely to be able to do the kind of engaged long-term ethnographic work. And so those relationships that I've developed have enabled me to kind of ask other questions about, what actually is useful to you. Here are some of the sort of scholarly or perhaps political questions I'm interested in, but how can these sort of put your agenda at the center? And that's a luxury to be able to do that. For many of us, particularly junior scholars, it's super difficult to do in a dissertation, where you have productivity that you need to do. So I got tenure, and then I was like, okay, I can really do more kind of engaged and participatory research now, and write for different audiences. But it is very dialogic, and it is by definition accepting what's good enough in terms of research, like what constitute data and people's ability to do research. And so I mean, we're working with kind of research teams, but they're not trained anthropologists, and so I'm looking at sort of transcripts and being like, oh, I wish you would ask this, and so it is sometimes about piecing together kind of different forms of knowledge, but always kind of going back and forth about it, and then understanding that that timelines are going to have to always be flexible, because for many of the people we're working with, this is their activism. They've got 2 other jobs usually, and are handling so many other things. They tend to be forgiving when I'm late, and then conversely, I get it, because they're trying to hold down various other jobs. It becomes very much of an issue about what are the practicalities and the logistics of life and of doing research, often across across great distances. And I do feel like it's a very rich way of doing this work, and I don't make big claims for it. You know, it's limited, but knowledge is powerful, and even by having conversations and presenting a kind of framework for understanding, for instance, the renewable energy projects in Southeast Morocco, even by presenting the framework of our project, which is essentially the critique that is in this article that you've put at the center of this page, or my contribution to it. You know, people who are kind of participating in our project have just said, I've never thought about it in these terms. You know, so not waiting until we do produce that beautiful book or article, but having these be critiques that we develop over time and share with people, it does create new modes of talking about things, and a kind of ownership of the project. That this is way beyond me. Like, folks have taken this and they're doing what they, you know, what they will with it, and so I don't have that control, and that's probably a good thing. So I'll leave it at that. Nejm, for you.
Yeah, I guess for me, so you have the pragmatic kind of issues and problems around research, you know, and teaching is certainly a part of that. I think partly it's due to the nature of, you know, the themes that we're talking about. Now, with anthropology and anthropologists, we often get kind of, you know, pigeonholed as a scholar of a particular region, and we, you know, to some degree. But I think personally, I've become very interested in the broader themes, and so I'm interested in how those translate across contexts. Now, sometimes they don't, but in some cases we can learn lessons across themes, and so we have this discussion within anthropology. There's a difference between ethnography and there's a difference between anthropology. And so the idea of this very focused, you know, hyper detailed studies, which are, you know, on the one hand, you know, incredibly important and rich, but how do those translate into bigger questions about humanity and what's going on with the planet? And so again, this translates to my scholarship and my teaching. I see myself very much as an educator as much as a researcher. And so I'm constantly thinking about these themes in different contexts and in different geographies. And so even though we're talking about North Africa today, I'm constantly looking at social movements, you know, in North Africa, in Alaska, in the Philippines, and drawing out, you know, different commonalities, different, you know, different themes. And of course, the question is, you know, around scale, how do we think about climate, you know, and I believe, Katie, your work is also, you know, speaks to this, and this idea of the hyperlocal, and how do they think about, you know, these global themes, but how do we also get there? And what is this difference between a global community and a local community, you know, working on local issues as opposed to global issues? You know, there's a lot to break down there, but it's, I believe, work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And just to reflect on your responses, like Karen, when you were speaking, like, I think quite powerfully about what feels to me like the ethics of the work that you do, as much as the practicalities. I think you were reminding us and inviting us to work in ways that are not extractive, if we can do non-extractive scholarship on extraction, in that you were really highlighting toward the end of your reflection the need to take time and to share, that these are collective endeavors. So I feel, to me, like working connectively to do it ethically in the way that you're encouraging us to do. And Nejm, I think you reminded us about, like, when we're tracing these connections, as you say, you can't think about Algeria without thinking about Morocco, without thinking about the Sahara. When we look at those kinds of connections here and now, today, it also, I think, makes us attend to histories of flow. And Karen, you spoke about this earlier when you were in the archives, and things are coming up that have been there, and perhaps no one has attended to them in the way that you have. So we see histories of flow, histories of exchange, like flows of power, the circulation of knowledge and sharing as well. So to me, like, I don't know, I always, it makes me think of Angela Davis and her, I think recently, her quite strong appeals to maybe resurrect or revisit the language of internationalism, and not just the language, but actually the practice of internationalism within our work as well. So now I want to invite, I'll take just probably 7 more minutes of everyone's time to ask the questions and conversation, but I'd like to invite the other contributors who are here. So I know Hamdi and Kelly and Grace are with us today. So you're welcome to reflect and to share your experiences as well with this question. I'm really struck by how part of what we're seeing today and creating what you're creating really through the platform is a mode of communication. And it's one that brings complex analyses to a wide audience, again, most of whom are not, thankfully, academics. And the digital platform, as we've seen with Mimi and as people have moved through it as we're speaking, combines really engaged scholarly writing with art and sound and imagery. And I think this reaches and moves its audience or audiences, multiple audiences, through many channels in many senses. And it feels important that in doing so, the platform is centering the global South, or what's I think increasingly being called the majority world, as well as aesthetics and activism. And we've spoken a bit about this, mostly primarily activism or organizing, and a little bit less thinking about the global South and aesthetics. So I want to invite everyone who's been involved in the development of the platform to reflect on kind of thinking about the significance of working in this way. So how does this centering of the global South, aesthetics and activism contribute differently to knowledge and action and transformation? Or maybe the question is, does it? Like, how does it, or does it? And just really to share with us what your experience has been in working in this way. So I will open it to anyone who would like to reflect. Perhaps Grace, or Hamdi, or Kelly, if you'd like to kick us off, if you've had a moment to think about it as well.
Kelly, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. First of all, thank you to all the presenters. This was really very fascinating and enjoyable. There's a lot of food for thought in there, and I am. Here's my disclaimer. I'm still formulating my thoughts, so at the risk of sounding a bit incoherent here, let me just share at least one of the notes I was taking. I had a thought in response to Nejm's comment about trying to see how people think about what they do instead of imposing our own categories and frameworks of action on people as we conduct research. I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of my own work in Morocco, on gender activism in Morocco and other countries around the world. There is a bit of a double-edged sword to that, I think. So there's a comment and then the question will come. It's in there. I've got to tease it out a little bit. So there's a bit of a double-edged sword there, I think, in that I find, at least I've found in my experience, people often respond to you in terms of what they think you want to hear. But more specifically, in a setting like Morocco, I found that the agendas are somewhat scripted, and people can't always speak in the way they really would like to. And Karen, I think you touched on this as well. I think, you know, at least for me working in Morocco, people spoke the language of feminism to me, whether it was somebody from, you know, a government minister I was speaking to, or, you know, a person or a family rather who was living in a village just outside of Ouarzazate. And the more people I interviewed, the more I realized, well, this seems to be you know, this language all sounds the same. The comments all sound the same, even though I know from others' work, including Karen's work, that there are a lot of, there is a lot of tension surrounding the issue of resource allocation, land rights, and so forth. So I guess my question is, in a way, it's how do we find that balance, especially when we're working in an environment where, you know, in a place like Morocco, you have to be keenly aware of what you say and what you write, and whether or not you'll be able to do further research in that country if you write things that are too heavily critical of the government. At the same time, I have to say, you know, there and other places I've gone in as the skeptic and actually been quite impressed by what I've seen. So I'm a little bit on the fence about this. You know, of course, it's important to speak to people and try to understand what's important to them, how they see what they're doing. But then on the other hand, how do you balance that against, you know, what are inevitably going to be your own sort of predilections, your own maybe sort of biases about how to come to the topic. If I'm coming at the topic from the perspective that, you know, these people are gender activists, well, maybe that's not at all how they see themselves, but I've got to write the article or I've got to write the book. And so somehow I am bound by these categories, no matter what I'd like to do. So I don't know if that question is easy or too broad to answer, but it's sort of the struggling that I think a number of you have expressed already, the struggle with, you know, trying to sort out these categories, but also trying to sort out your own role as a researcher as you are there on the ground doing research and interacting with people who may or may not be giving you the whole story, at least not at that particular time.
If I can jump in, I think you raised such an important question that is never going to be answered, right? It's always going to be a tension in our work, and there's never a one-size-fits-all response, even in one area that we're working in. You know, over time, it's going to change. But it reminded me of a particular example right now. So I'm working with some sort of civil society activists from kind of the southeast of Morocco. So where's this at Tunisia or Rashidiyya area, in a new province to them, Nidal. They don't have the same networks. They don't know the backstory and the internal politics behind a lot of what's going on. And so the interviews we've been doing and the basic research look very, very different than that in Zagora, which is very kind of familiar territory for the people I'm working with. And seeing that difference has really shed light for me on your question, because indeed, particularly sort of a group of sort of I really just cannot stand the word tribe, but it's a, you know, ethnic collectivity of nomads, Murad, who are new to, you know, were implanted in the province, you know, about 100 years ago by the French. So they're talking with us about the solar energy facility and how it enclosed 4,000 hectares. And my research partner said, you know, who's from Tunisia, said, well, you know, they're really saying the same things. They've all met as a group to provide a kind of unified answer. And I said, well, you know, there are many ways in which we can address this. And one of the things he said is, well, it could also be just true. Like they're saying the same things because they've all experienced those same things. And there are many layers to this. And sort of those kind of, that politics of knowledge has really struck me as very interesting. So what are they telling us when they do meet and come up with a unified answer? That in and of itself provides us really wonderful information to kind of work with. And so it really does involve always kind of questioning and thinking through what's going on the margins of what we're actually talking about, or the deep genealogy of why people are assuming stances that you've had, whether it's for some, you know, political self-censorship or this sense of solidarity with their, you know, the sort of local notables, whatever it is. And so in many respects, I've actually learned how to navigate it by talking less and you know, just sort of seeing how things are unfolding and understanding the limitations of anything we're going to get. So I really appreciate your comment.
Could I add briefly to that? And
yeah.
I think it's such a good question, and you know, the fact it for me, it's, you know, really speaking to this kind of ethics of research, and I think our, you know, our presence is always going to create bias, and depending on what they think, the reasons why they want us to be there or don't want us to be there in the first place. I remember I worked really hard to try to choose where I would go, and whether they wanted me to be there or not. And I remember, you know, that being a very, very important thing to me. And on the one hand, I would have, for example, farmers working on social movement projects for them as working in terms of institutions environmentally. And as you said, I recognized a particular discourse, right, that would be, you know, put together as, okay, we want to work towards participation, and where had these kind of terminologies come from? And I think, as Karen had mentioned, you know, often it is actually true. At the same time, trying to kind of listen between the layers of that discourse is sometimes simply a question of time and relationality and trust. And now we don't always have the luxury of being able to spend, you know, long, in-depth research like anthropologists are supposedly well known to do. But if possible, you know, that, for example, I had a farmer called Hamdou, and he would, you know, he would just talk to me about the usual thing, but it wasn't until 4 months later, when we were sitting together having lunch underneath the palm tree, that he started to talk to me about his political work. And I had no idea that he was involved in formal politics. He told me about his role. And so my point in telling this story is that sometimes, you know, this information would come out just when you're sitting together in the evening, breaking bread, you know, but I think, again, it's our bias, you know, is always going to affect, you know, how, you know, the types of things that we talk about. So, yeah, just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Grace and Hamdi, would you like to contribute any reflections or experiences? And if not, that's completely fine.
Actually, thank you. I was hearing all the speakers talking about the different experience, actually, and I see Tunisia is close to that's all that is experience, actually. Now we have a new chapter of fear. That's since Russian-Ukrainian war, we are under the pressure to be the huge battery for Europe, and now we have the orientation or sense to be that Tunisia will be kind of huge battery to produce hydrogen for Europe. And that is not taking into consideration our, we are a country are suffering so much for our resource for water, for example. We didn't have enough water for our usual consumption, for agriculture, for households. So now we have a new, as I said, it's a new chapter for before. It was what's happened for Morocco, it's supposed to happen in Tunisia, but unfortunately it's not happened. Now when I'm hearing some people are giving witnesses what's happened for agriculture, I tried to integrate the new notion of agrovoltaics that's making, using the lands for to produce energy instead of producing food. And that's actually a huge problem for populations that are the main basic source of income in our economy is agriculture. And that's if we are supposed to replace clean energy, and it's a green energy. Now we are talking, for example, that green energy is really useful for us. If they didn't have the dark side of the green energy, nobody talk about the green side. The dark side of the green energy would be good experience for us. It's not an alternative for that. It's good for some people of some nations. They have a power, economic power. Like for example, for us, Europe is near to us and consider us as the background to not doing things are prohibited in Europe, but that they can do it here in Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco. So we have a large discussion for that, and we try to keep our population and our media, especially media, because now we try to influence media, and if things going directly to media, and usually, unfortunately, we're using some populist discourse. Now we use it, the populist discourse, because it's our only weapon to catch attention of population. That's very fast, And that's bring to some opinion that the problematic is existing. So I know it's not something good, but that's the only solution, actually, what we have now. And we try to use social web to at least given the alternative opinion from the banks, the international banks, they're giving other opinion, the government give other opinion, but we have our own opinion. We have not aligned for anyone. We have tried to defend the interest of local community for people who are not the voice to express with enough of freedom. Now, since the revolution here in Tunisia, we are a democracy now, but the democracy is threatened, and we have something that you didn't any nation experience it yet, because we have kind of over freedom, and the over freedom for the people in the first time of our history we experienced that, or living through this experience is not easy for in 10 years to consider a democracy as something that's belong to us. It's not easy to consider that the freedom could be a usual or daily practice that we can live with it every day in daily life. So we have various actual problems, but we try to handle with it, and we try to at least be aware for what's coming up, because we're watching all what's happened. We watch what's happened in Algeria. It's the same actually in Tunisia. We watch what's happened. Algeria maybe is more powerful than Tunisia economically, so they have the autonomy of decision, but Tunisia unfortunately not. We have under FME control now, so we will be accepting many projects that will be in our benefit, and we are very aware of that. And we see what will be if Tunisian economy collapses, what will be the impact for Europe, for example. Million on million of immigrants coming from African country will cross Tunisia and simply will be like a highway to Europe. That will be a problem for us and problem for them and problem for this population that are looking for a good opportunity. What now we see, and with the drought, that many local community that are living from agriculture is collapses. It's really collapses. We see olive tree is dying. We see not enough of water or resources to use on that, and we see that will be the next generation of climate immigrant, not in Pacific, but here in Mediterranean. It's 100 kilometers from southern border of Europe, and that's actually our challenge. It's not so easy to talk of that. And thank you to sharing this experience with you.
Thank you so much, Hamdi. You've traced connections and highlighted really significant issues. Grace, can I invite you to reflect as well, or opt out as you wish?
I'll just say one small thing is that this entire project, so I'm the cartographer, the person who made the maps, and this project has really just underscored how easy it is to find data and map information when it's something that the government wants to be known for, and how incredibly difficult it is when it's on a subject that is just less important or can be in opposition to, or is much more localized in and about local communities. And so Mimi knows from our many back and forths, the maps that you see on these articles are not necessarily the first that were conceived. They are based on the information that we could find about these issues. And so you see, Morocco, for example, we would have loved to display the overlap between solar plants, which were easy to find, and transhumance populations and pastoral ranges, but that just was not really feasible. And so that situation happens, you find yourself in this situation again and again, that your story, especially when you're not working locally with folks, really is shaped by the predominant narratives, whether you want them to be or not.
Yes. Wow, that's an important reminder. And now you have me really wanting you to do a project on the maps that never were. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm quite aware of the time. It's very close to the end of our session. So although I have another question, I'm going to table it, just put it to the side, and invite anyone from the audience who would like to ask questions of any of our guests, any of the contributors here today, to do so. You can write it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and you unmute and then speak with everyone here today. So this is the moment for the questions, if anyone has a question. And if I don't see your hand, by all means, just go ahead. Any questions? Or I can close with my question, my last. Okay. I think I'll go ahead, but if anyone thinks of anything in the meantime, please put it in the chat. So I think I just want to close by coming back to the work that you've so generously and critically put together for this platform. Karen, you end your article by stating, and I quote you, "For these critics," and here you're referring to environmental scholars and activists, "as for the residents of southeastern Morocco, the question is not whether renewable energy in Morocco or anywhere else is good or bad, but how to design an energy transition that also prioritizes equity and a fundamental rethinking of the economic and political models that gave rise to the climate crisis to begin with," end quote. And Nejm, I see your work very much as grappling with this as well, and the contributions from everyone else, from Grace and Hamdi and Kelly, have underscored this. Like, how do we hold on to these larger structures and forces, dynamics, discourses, and kind of move away from these good and bad evaluations? So my question for you is, how can IMPOP, this platform, and its users participate in questioning and confronting how we arrive to the climate crisis, with very particular contexts and communities paying the highest price? How might we also become part of a movement that envisions and materially creates something otherwise? And it's kind of maybe circling back to that notion of hope that was raised earlier in the event as well. So I invite you to reflect on that as our final question.
If I could just say something briefly in response to that. You know, I think about this question also in the broader sense of how, you know, what are we as scholars doing in terms of, you know, the wider public, how we in terms of how we could be interacting with the wider public. And something that I've long thought is that, you know, universities in you know, well-funded universities in North America and Europe and Australia can act as forums for South-South dialogues and collaborations. And so I do think that there's a potential for networking across these borders, not just geographical borders or ideological borders, but also just in terms of like who we are, whether it's you know, a person who's a scholar or working for a nonprofit organization or, you know, a leader in their community. The difficult part, though, is certainly part of the difficulty is not everybody has equal access to the internet. But the other part is that and I don't have a solution for this, but that we often tend to hear from in these kinds of forums the usual suspects, or the people that I would say are the usual suspects, right? The people who have some experience already talking to people like us, working with people like us, or working with people, you know, in these sort of international funding sphere. So I still do think that, you know, we could provide here a forum both to generate our own ideas and to hear from others who may not otherwise be heard, but that this could serve as a kind of launching pad then for what has to be an additional step, which ultimately is, I think, going to have to involve physically going to a place, speaking with people, interacting, building relationships, and either encouraging them to share their stories, whether on this platform or sharing it with us and allowing us to share it with others. But anyway, those are my thoughts on how we could take this forward and expand it.
Thank you.
I also think there's a powerful audience among the kind of informed readers. So, you know, the other scholars in the Middle East who don't maybe work on these environmental issues, the people who are maybe close circle of people who are reading MERIP, and then, being very proactive about reaching out to new audiences, because I find that some of these messages are even a big surprise to other people who are experts on the Middle East, who are from the Middle East, who really pushing forward the more critical questions, because I can't tell you how many times I've gone, but renewable energy is good. Sure. Yeah. And, it's the same kind of discourse that I see here of like, well, the people in Appalachia like coal, so they get what they deserve. And so really kind of piercing some of the assumptions that people have, even, and perhaps especially progressive or, entre guillemets, liberal people. So.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think this is, the big question and the big challenge. And I think, this necessarily has, ideational components and material components. And getting to the material components, I think, is the challenge. From the ideational kind of approach, I think what's really important about initiatives like this is really the appeal to the imagination through the humanities. And this is really what I've got to through my work recently on communication. And, this stuff is difficult in terms of thinking about environmental problems. And it can be, as I mentioned before, from a humanitarian level, and someone working on issues of justice and social movements, or people, working in the field, it can be very tough emotionally and so on. And so how to act on this, I think, involves the imagination. And so I think the role of the humanities, the arts, music, these kind of things can motivate people massively more. Not that people can't handle facts, but sometimes we need not just facts in order to really spark the imagination and to see things on a bigger scale. And so connecting the dots between the local and other scales often takes that spark of imagination, I think. And so, that for me has been the big standout thing. And I think that's where your work really can take a hold, whether it's cartoonists, whether it's working on, as I mentioned, kind of music and so on, as we've always had in social movements, right? We've had, Sheikh Ahmed, poets and so on, is really at the forefront, not just giving us, this is how many we have of so-and-so, and that moving towards having that pressure, moving towards more equitable kind of relations of, whether it's directly redistribution, whether it's direct involvement. We know, coming again, circling back to your point right at the beginning, we don't have power without resistance. And so having some of the biggest changes, learning lessons from some of the biggest successes in environmental movements has been this sustained concerted pressure. So I think I'll stop there, but I really, this emphasis on the imagination and the humanities is a source of hope, at least for me.
That's a beautiful place for us to end. Thank you all so much for your reflections, your experience, your wisdom, and inspiration. I'll hand it back to Mona to say the final goodbye, and just say I have 3 pages of intensive notes. So I've learned a lot, and I'm grateful to you all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie, for coordinating that amazing conversation. And thank you to all of you for joining us, both as participants and as the audience. We hope you'll spend more time with the content and share widely. And as I wrote in the chat, share your feedback. We're constantly trying to improve the work. We're hoping to do another iteration this year. With a few more pieces and to continue this project. So we really appreciate anything you can do to get the word out about IMPOP. And with that, I will again thank everybody, and we look forward to seeing you in the future at more events and hopefully another launch next year. Thanks again.